High in the hills above Guadalcanal, a young American lieutenant named John George is hunting the snipers who are hunting his battalion. If you've heard his name online, you've heard the legend. A $60 mail-order Winchester his officers laughed at, and 11 Japanese snipers killed with it in exactly 4 days. He was real. The hunting was real. But his own book, one of the most honest accounts ever written about rifle combat in the Pacific, tells a different story. The scoreboard is invented, and the rifle, the one thing every retelling treats as bedrock, never reached the island at all. Start with the man, because the legend gets him half right. Before the war, John George was one of the best rifle shots in Illinois. He'd come up through the National Guard, spending his weekends on the firing line, and at Fort Sheridan in 1938, he won the state rifle championship, the youngest man ever to take it, and the state long-range title in the same match. Rifle shooting in those years was a serious civilian sport. Clubs and matches and men who could stack 5 rounds into a fist-sized group at distances most soldiers never trained for. George lived inside that world. He knew wind and light and the slow discipline of a long shot the way other men knew a trade. And he owned the rifle from the legend, a Winchester Model 70, a civilian bolt-action chambered in .30-06, the kind of gun a man buys to punch paper on a Sunday range or take a deer in the fall. The retellings say he paid about $60 of his guard pay for it. His own book never bothers with the price. What the book does record is what happened to that rifle next, and it's the detail every viral version skips. Before George shipped out, a friend borrowed the Winchester and ruined the barrel. The rifle went back to the factory for repair, and the transport left without it. George walked up the gangplank to the Pacific carrying standard government iron, kicking himself, in his own words, for being so careless with his Model 70. The finest civilian marksman's rifle in the story spent the battle for Guadalcanal in a repair queue and a mail sack. What George did about it is where the real story starts. He wrote home. He asked his family to ship the repaired Winchester after him and to hurriedly send something else. A Lyman Alaskan telescopic sight with a mount cut for a Springfield service rifle, addressed to an Army post office in the South Pacific. If his own rifle couldn't make it in time, he would build a sniper rifle out of whatever the Army had and put civilian glass on top of it. That's exactly what he did. On the way to the fight, on a captain's advice, he pulled a hand-picked Springfield out of turn-in stock, an M1903 bolt gun with a star-gauged barrel, the mark of an unusually accurate one. When the scope caught up with him, he fitted the Alaskan to the Springfield. And the Winchester, when it finally arrived? He loaned it to a major for hunting wild boar on Espiritu Santo, an island away from the war. The mail-order rifle the internet puts on Guadalcanal was shooting pigs on New Hebrides plantations, while George went into the hills with a scoped Springfield. Understand what that scope meant, because this is the argument George spent the rest of his life making. Iron sights are fast and rugged. They never fog or crack, which is exactly why the Army loved them. A telescopic sight is fussier and more fragile, but it does one thing iron cannot. It pulls a distant, half-hidden target out of the clutter and lays it flat against the crosshairs, close enough to read. In December 1942, almost nobody in an American rifle company had one. George was betting that in the right hands, that trade was worth everything. The ground he walked into put the bet to the test. His regiment, the 132nd Infantry of the Americal Division, landed on Guadalcanal in early December and was ordered inland onto Mount Austen, a tangle of ridges and ravines a few miles behind the beachhead. Their objective was a Japanese strongpoint the Americans called the Gifu, a horseshoe of bunkers dug into the jungle between the hills, so well hidden that companies walked into its fire lanes without ever seeing a gun. The neighboring hills, the ones the maps nicknamed the Galloping Horse and the Seahorse, would be stormed by another division in January. The Gifu belonged to the 132nd, and it held out for 5 brutal weeks into late January. The Gifu ground the regiment down in a way the maps never showed. Attacks that looked like a morning's work on paper took days and came back bloodied. And by the time the strongpoint finally fell, the 132nd had paid for those ravines with hundreds of dead and wounded. This was the fight George's battalion was living inside. Not a duel on an empty range, but a siege in a green cellar. And the snipers were the part of it a rifleman could least defend against. The jungle did half the enemy's work. Light came down through the canopy in broken patches. Glare and deep shadow layered on top of each other. And the man standing still in the wrong shade simply disappeared. The Japanese marksmen used all of it. Some tied themselves into the trees. Others built firing nests back in the green, camouflaged so well that a soldier could stare straight at one from 40 yards and see nothing but leaves. They shot with patience, not volume. There would be a single crack, one man would fall, and then silence, while the whole platoon dropped and searched a wall of jungle that gave them nothing back. And they hunted the right men. Snipers on Guadalcanal went after officers and radio operators on purpose, trying to cut the head and the voice off a unit in a single shot. Every man with a map case or a radio antenna learned to feel exposed. The damage wasn't only the bodies. It was what the fear did to a company that couldn't shoot back at something it couldn't see. And morale bled out one invisible shot at a time. Some of it was bait. A sniper would fire a loose shot, not to hit anyone, but to pull a reaction, and then wait for the careless movement that showed him his next target. Men stood up to point. Men bunched together to look. Both fed the trap. The jungle rewarded stillness and punished the natural human urge to do something. And learning that cost lives. George watched men make those mistakes, and he was taking notes. Hold on to that fear, because it is the raw material the legend is built from. The usual answer to a hidden sniper was noise. Pour fire into the suspected patch of jungle, rake it with a .50 caliber machine gun, walk mortar rounds across the top of the ridge, and either kill the shooter or scare him into moving. On open ground, that worked. In this steep, blind, layered terrain, it often meant hammering empty leaves while the sniper sat tight 2 ridges over. Firepower wasn't what was missing. What the men on those slopes needed was a pair of eyes that could find one still man in a mile of green, and almost nobody had them. George worked the opposite way. 1 shooter at a time, 1 shot each, with the same slow patience that wins a long-range match. Where the battalion saw a solid wall of jungle, the competition shooter saw a problem he'd been training to solve his whole life. He read the jungle the way he read a firing line. A competitor learns to notice the things that don't belong, the shadow with a hard edge, the branch that swings against the wind, the flat gleam of light bouncing off glass or oiled metal where there should only be leaves. Those signs are almost nothing on their own. Stacked together, patiently, over long minutes of watching, they draw the outline of a man who thinks he's invisible. Then there was distance, the thing that beats most shooters. Judging range across a jungle ravine is brutal work, because the eye has nothing familiar to measure against, and the ground lies to you. George had spent years learning to read exactly that kind of empty space and turn it into an accurate hold. A shot that would be a wild guess for a line soldier was, for him, a calculation he'd run 1,000 times on a match range. That's where the mail-order glass earned its place. In the murk under the canopy, Iron sights and the naked eye lose a still target in the shadows, but the Alaskan pulled the same target up, bright and sharp and close. What looked like a solid green wall to the men around him resolved through his scope into branches and dirt and the small wrong shape of a face. He could see the sniper before the sniper understood he'd been seen. And in that kind of fight, the first shot is everything. Two marksmen hunting each other don't trade rapid fire. Whoever sees first and hits first wins, and the loser usually never gets a second shot off. His book preserves one of those moments exactly. In the groves near Point Cruz, George glassed a suspected position and found a man's chin resting precisely on the flat-topped post of the Alaskan's reticle, 80 yards out. And here the competition discipline showed in a way no legend bothers with. He didn't fire on the shape, he read it first. The wrapped leggings told him it was a Japanese soldier and not a lost American, because on that island, in that light, the worst mistake a marksman could make wasn't missing, it was hitting the wrong man. Only when the details settled the question did he steady his breath and take up the slack in the trigger, and the Springfield rolled back into his shoulder. The leaves swallowed the echo, and one more rifle that had been bleeding the line went quiet for good. That engagement is in the record because George wrote it down, range, reticle, leggings and all. How many times it happened is the question the internet thinks it has answered. What set him apart wasn't nerve, it was habit. A trained competitor does the same small things the same way every time, under pressure or not, so that when everything around him is chaos, the shot itself stays boring and mechanical. That deadness under stress is the one thing the Army's mass training couldn't hand out along with a rifle. George brought it with him, built over years of matches where nobody was shooting back. None of this was clean or easy. It meant lying still in the heat and the insects for hours, matching an enemy who was just as patient and just as willing to wait. It meant being the man the other side most wanted to kill, doing the exact job the Japanese snipers were doing, only better. One careless movement and the hunter became the target. He kept doing it anyway, position after position, because he was the only tool the battalion had that fit the job. That much is down in the record. Now put the record next to the legend. In the viral version, the one that runs across a dozen near-identical channels, his officers laugh at his mail-order toy. 14 Americans die under sniper fire in 72 hours, and then George grabs his Winchester and kills 11 Japanese snipers in exactly 4 days. It's clean, and it comes with a perfect scoreboard. Now count what actually survives. The man, real. The skill, real, and documented in his own hand. The mail-order glass, the counter-sniper hunting, the hills above the beachhead, all of it holds up. The scoreboard does not. That exact tally, 11 snipers in 4 days, along with the sneering officers and the 14 dead in 72 hours, appears nowhere in George's book, and nowhere in the unit record. It comes from the modern retellings themselves, one channel copying the last until the figures hardened into fact through sheer repetition. And the retellings get the one physical object at the center of the story wrong. The Winchester Model 70, the $60 hero of every thumbnail, never fired a shot on Guadalcanal. It was hunting boar on another island. The rifle that actually did the work was a government Springfield wearing a scope that came through the Army mail. The legend's bedrock fact doesn't survive contact with the primary source, and the primary source is the hero's own book. The strange thing is that the real source cuts against the legend everywhere it matters. George wrote to get the details right, the ranges and the light and the way a shot actually behaved, not to sell a number to a crowd. The man who was actually there kept no scoreboard. Maybe some of the men did rib a junior officer about his fancy civilian glass. That kind of thing is as old as armies. But the scripted scene of sneering officers eating their words on cue is the storyteller's touch, not the record's. The honest version is quieter, and in a way, it's harder to beat. A champion shooter improvised a sniper rifle from spare parts and mail, hunted the most dangerous men on the island with it, one careful shot at a time, and lived to write down exactly how. That book, the one the legend keeps borrowing credibility from, came out in 1947. Shots fired in anger, a rifleman's eye account of Guadalcanal and later Burma, where George fought with Merrill's marauders through some of the worst jungle of the entire war. It isn't a general's memoir of grand strategy. It's the war at the level of one man and one rifle. The ranges, the optics, the feel of the ground, all set down with the plain accuracy of someone who cared more about getting it right than sounding heroic. Among people who know rifles, it never really went away. For decades, it's been held up as one of the straightest first-hand accounts of small arms combat in the Pacific, precisely because George refused to inflate it. After the war, the people who thought hard about marksmanship listened to him. His detailed reporting on scoped rifles and long-range shooting fed a bigger argument inside the army about how far an ordinary rifleman could really reach. You'll hear it claimed that his writings single-handedly pushed official sniper ranges from 600 yards out to 1,000. That's too clean. Doctrine never moves on one book by one lieutenant. What's fair to say is simpler and still real. George was one clear, credible, first-hand voice, arguing that good glass and a trained eye could reach much farther than the standard doctrine assumed. And the record he left made that case hard to wave away. He even sketched where it was all heading. In the book, he mused about marrying a scope like his Alaskan to the semi-automatic Garand, a self-loading rifle with real glass on top, which is more or less a description of the sniper rifles that came after. The lieutenant improvising in a jungle in 1942 was describing the standard equipment of armies that didn't exist yet. Followed all the way through, the story traces a strange arc. The famous rifle missed the war and became a legend anyway. The improvised one, a repair rack Springfield under $60 worth of hunting glass, did the killing, changed the argument, and was nearly forgotten. The men who first saw that civilian scope took it for a toy. It outlived the war, and now the truth it belongs to is outliving the legend built on top of it, for one reason. The man who carried it wrote down exactly what it did, and never once made the number bigger. For more deep dives into military history, make sure you're subscribed to the channel.